Hey, we're going to come back with a continuation on the Constitutional Convention. Constitution is going to be called, or this Constitutional Convention is going to be called for because of the weaknesses perceived in the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation were put together primarily because the delegates at the time that that government was drafted were anti-strong national government and wanted to keep the majority of the power within the hands of the states. We know what the problems were. The problems were the inability to tax, to raise an army, and to regulate interstate commerce. All right, so let's look. We're going to call for a constitutional convention, and actually, it's going to be George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. We're going to call for this convention. And from a Southern point of view, they were more interested in trade than they were. They were having some problems, and Alexander Hamilton prompted something called the Annapolis Convention. Not too many people showed up, so what they decided they'd do is plan it for a year out and see if they couldn't get more people to show up. And that's exactly what happened. Okay, so let's just get a brief overview of what the Constitutional Convention is all about. It's going to be between May and September 1787, the hot time of the year. Delegates from 12 states are going to convene in Philadelphia, and they're going to be there to revise the Articles of Confederation. Do you recall what it took to make a change to the Articles of Confederation? I believe it had to be a unanimous affirmation of the change. So the convention was the site of a lot of debate over the size, scope, and structure of the federal government, and its result was the United States Constitution, and probably the formation of political parties because of the way that folks were kind of polarizing about the extent that the national government should be involved in telling the states what to do. And probably one of the more notorious outcomes was the Three-Fifths Compromise from this Constitution. It apportioned representation to Southern slaveholding states that counted 5 enslaved men and women as 3 people. Okay, well, that's also going to be a gauge for taxation, but we'll get back to that in just a second. Okay, so creating the new government. From May until September in 1787, 55 delegates are crammed into a hot room in Philadelphia where they're keeping the windows closed so that nobody can be eavesdropping as to what they may be talking about inside. Rhode Island was the only state that refused to send representatives to the convention, which assumed as its primary task the revision or replacement of the Articles of Confederation. Though the Articles of Confederation had provided the framework for governance since the Declaration of the American Revolution against Britain, many of the fledgling nation's political leaders agreed that the creation of a stronger central government was essential to the development of the power and potential of the United States. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government lacked the power of taxation. It had no authority to regulate commerce and was impotent to resolve conflicts arising between the states. So the children could act up and the mom couldn't do anything to make them stop. But seeking to bolster the authority of this federal government, the delegates gathered at Independence Hall in Philadelphia and elected George Washington to preside over this convention. Not everybody had in mind that they were going to bolster the authority of the federal government. They were just going to try and fix things. And this is part of the mythology associated with early American history. And not everybody agreed. If they had, we wouldn't have 2 political parties today. One of the most spirited debates at the convention regarded the composition of the legislative branch of government, the lawmaking branch of government. Should the legislature be unicameral, one house, as it was under the Articles of Confederation, or bicameral, consisting of 2 houses, following upon the British model, an upper house and a lower house? Perhaps more importantly, should the representation in the legislature be apportioned, meaning how are we going to determine what each state is going to get. All right, so the fellow that came up with the grand scheme that was primarily adopted was James Madison out of Virginia, and therefore his plan was called the Virginia Plan. It called for a bicameral legislation in which representation would be based on population, just population. Now, why would he be calling for that? Because Virginia was one of the largest states at the time. He thought if you had more people within your state, then you should be afforded more voice in the government. The larger states supported the plan because it would accord them greater representation based on the more numerous populations. However, smaller states were opposed to it and submitted a competing proposal, the New Jersey Plan, which was a smaller plan. According to this scheme, which was basically inherited from the Articles of Confederation, the legislature would continue to be unicameral and each state would have a single vote. So let's go back and take a small review of what was said earlier about everyone wanting to make a stronger federal government. That was not true. The states were clamoring to have equal power, and they wanted to ensure that they were going to have equality in legislation. All right, so drafting or writing the Constitution. The delegates ultimately combined the elements of both plans, what was the New Jersey and what was the Virginia plan, and what was called, let's bring a third state in, the Connecticut Compromise. The legislative branch would be bicameral, consisting of an upper house, the Senate, and a lower house, the House of Representatives. Okay, the house, the lower one, would be based on population, and each state was allotted 2 seats in the Senate. The office of the president would constitute the executive authority and was to be chosen by the Electoral College. We'll get into that in a little bit. The structure of government would be federalist in nature, meaning that it would consist of 3 independent branches, a sharing of power, the legislature, the Congress, which is comprised of the Senate and the House of Representatives. The second branch would be the executive, which is the president, and the third would be the judicial branch, which is going to be the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court would adjudicate disputes between the states, and Congress was authorized to levy taxes and declare war and raise an army and regulate interstate commerce and draft laws consistent with the purpose of exercising these powers. The compromise also addressed another major point of contention between northern and southern states, and that was the issue of slavery. Should enslaved people be counted for the purpose of a state's representation in Congress? Well, of course, every southern slaveholder is going to say absolutely they should. The Three-Fifths Compromise established that enslaved men and women would be represented in the House at a ratio of 3 to 5 of their actual numbers. Thus, every 5 individuals would count as 3 for the purposes of both legislative representation and taxation. Don't forget the taxation portion. Alrighty, so the Three-Fifths Compromise was one of the most notorious provisions of the Constitution. For delegates from some of the northern states, some who were morally opposed to the institution of slavery, the compromise was viewed as a necessary evil in order to secure the ratification of the Constitution, since southern states had threatened to refuse to ratify the document if the interests of the southern slaveholders were not protected therein. Boom, yeah. Okay. That's going to raise its ugly head again. All right, now, we got the southern states to buy in. Now we've got to ratify or approve the Constitution. To ratify, before the Constitution could take effect, it had to be ratified, formally approved by the legislatures of at least 9 of the 12 states that had sent delegates to the convention. Ironically enough, after the acrimonious debates over legislation and its representation, the small states were the first to ratify the Constitution. The most serious opposition to ratifying the document came from the larger states of Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. These states were home to large rural populations that sympathized with the plight of farmers like Daniel Shays, who had spearheaded a rebellion against what he perceived as the unjust economic policies and political corruption of the Massachusetts state legislature. According to many of the Constitution's opponents, it would create a large, intrusive, and much too powerful federal government that would inevitably recreate the tyranny that the Patriots had fought against in the American Revolution. In order to combat this opposition and get the Constitution ratified, a series of amendments known as the Bill of Rights was appended to the document to ensure that the federal government would respect the natural rights of citizens. Well, what do you think? If you had to be a delegate at the Constitution Convention, would you have supported which plan, New Jersey or the Virginia? Can you think of anything the delegates could have done to ensure ratification of the Constitution without perpetuating the institution of slavery? And let's call it quits with that.